I'm introducing now Jing Fei, who is going to introduce our guest.
Yeah. So our guest speaker this week is Dan. Is Dan Golden. He worked for the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and also ProPublica. He had won like tons of awards, and one of which is a Pulitzer piece about basically about wealthy parents getting their children into elite colleges. So then, could you tell us a little about this of your story?
Yeah, that's what I'll talk about today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the playwright Eugene O'Neill, but he had a father named James, who he fictionalized a lot in his plays. But James, his story is that he was a very promising young actor, and he acted in all kinds of plays, Shakespeare, played Romeo and everything else. He was up and coming. And then he got the title role in something called The Count of Monte Cristo. He played the Count. And he was a big hit in that. He did it on Broadway. He toured the country. He played the Count of Monte Cristo all over. And lo and behold, he soon found that nobody wanted to see him in anything else. He was what you'd call typecast to an extreme. So he played the Count of Monte Cristo like 6,000 times, and he got very bitter and depressed and upset that he was stuck in this role and nobody ever wanted anything else. So I have a little bit of sympathy for James O'Neill because it's kind of like that with me in college admissions. So, I spent my career at the Globe not writing about college admissions. I was on the Spotlight team, and I was on the Sunday Magazine, and I was on the Focus section, and I wrote news, and I covered everything under the sun. And then I went to the Wall Street Journal as a higher education writer, and I happened to do a series about college admissions and how the rich buy their kids' way into elite colleges. And I'll explain how that came about in a minute, but that's dogged me ever since. So that I won a Pulitzer for that series. I turned it into a book that's a bestseller, and now, my book included some stuff about Jared Kushner and how his father bought his way into college long before anybody had heard of Jared Kushner. So now, no matter what I do, that's what I'm associated with. So like this past week or 10 days, we had this scandal about this independent counselor in California who bribed college coaches and faked SAT scores to get his wealthy clients' kids into college. And everybody wants to know what I think about that, and everybody's asking about my book, and I've been dragged right back into that again. I wrote another book that was about spying and stuff, but people don't generally bring that up. They want to just ask me about college admissions. So I think you probably got an article I wrote about, sort of looking back on how I found out about Jared Kushner. But I'll tell you a little bit about my experience in covering college admissions, and then we can talk about this current scandal or college admissions, or you can even give me a break and ask me about something else. So, so what happened, my history with this is I sort of came to it well prepared for it, because I grew up in Amherst, and my parents both taught at UMass. So I had a pretty good sense of what public universities were like. And I went to Harvard, so I had a good sense of what elite private universities were like. And so when I went to the Wall Street Journal, I decided to, I was hired to cover education. That's not what I wrote about at the Globe, but I had done a few things about education at the Globe, but it was enough to get me the job at the Journal, which was pretty much exactly 20 years ago in 1999. And I was fortunate at the Journal because it wanted me to cover higher education as a business. When I became an education journalist, a lot of education writers, they kind of took a featurey approach to it. They would do a feature about, a wonderful professor who was retiring, or a student who got a big award or something like that. I wasn't interested in any of that. My training at the Globe was as an investigative reporter and following the money. And my training was also that every organization, regardless of whether it's a nonprofit like a university or a government agency or a for-profit business or an organized crime syndicate like the mafia, they all basically want the same thing. They all want money and power. So that's the approach I took to higher education, and the Journal was a very good fit for that. And and the other aspect was, it's very hard to get a sense of the quality of education at a school or a university as a reporter. Because let's say you sit in a classroom, you decide, oh, I'm going to look at this class. Well, that class might not be good, but there's so many classes going on, maybe the other classes are really good. Or it might be great, but the other classes are lousy. So it's very hard to get sort of an internal sense of the quality of a place. And so I decided I'm not going to write about that. I'm going to write about the money and the business. And that's really what the journal wanted. So what happened was one of the big issues then as now was affirmative action, which is the admissions preference for underrepresented minorities, mainly blacks and Hispanics in college admissions. And there was a Supreme Court case back in 2003 about the University of Michigan. And there were some white students who were suing the University of Michigan because they hadn't gotten in, whereas minority students with lesser academic records had gotten in. And Michigan gave a boost to blacks and Hispanics, affirmative action, and so they were trying to get that struck down by the court. Now, I remember I wasn't going to write about this because my boss had said, we'll leave it to the Supreme Court reporter, but then he called me in the middle of a trip to do another story and told me I had to find a new angle, even though it was probably too late and I wouldn't find any. So I did what journalists do, and I went and got the file of the Michigan case, which was an enormous, stack of papers, yay high. And in there I found a document where Michigan explained its entire admissions system. And it turned out that affirmative action was far from its only preference. The system was more like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, with 1 million lifelines for candidates. It wasn't phoning a friend or whatever, but they were all lifelines. And so it turned out you got a big boost if your parent was an alumnus. You got another boost if your parent was in the state legislature and had control over Michigan's budget. You got another boost if you were a recruited athlete, and so on and so forth. And the great insight I had was that except for affirmative action, all the other preferences skewed white and wealthy, because most of the alumni kids were white. In athletics, we think of college basketball or football as having plenty of minorities, but there's dozens of sports that are not revenue generating and don't get on TV, but are pretty much limited to rich white people, like crew, polo, sailing, horseback riding, which is called equestrian events. They have very large teams in a lot of these sports, elite universities do, and yet those sports are not played at most public high schools, particularly in the inner city. But you get an admissions preference. If you're recruited to be on the women's crew team, that's a plus. But there's a lot of high schools, say in inner city Boston, that probably don't have a crew team. So I realized that all these preferences skewed white, and I began writing about that, and writing about how affirmative action. The point was, it can't be seen as like the one exception to merit. There's all these other exceptions to merit ruling in college admissions. And so the first story I did was about how the white kids in the Michigan case were complaining because somebody else got affirmative action, but actually they were legacies, so they got the legacy preference. So, they would have got in with a worse record than somebody else who wasn't a legacy. And then I did a story about Duke University, and of course, famous school in North Carolina, and how it had this huge number of development admits. These are kids who the parents are not alumni, so they're not legacies, but the families are rich, and so the fundraising office at the university puts their names on a list and gives it to admissions, and admissions is under pressure to let them in, whatever their record, because the parents are in a position to donate. So Duke was like the center of development admissions. And while I was researching Duke, I got my big break. Somebody directed me to a source who, I called him up to ask about somebody at Duke, and he said, I don't know anything about that kid. That kid the kid I was asking about had been at a school gone to prep school at a place called Groton, which is a famous Massachusetts prep school. Franklin Roosevelt went there. And he said, I don't know anything about that Groton kid, my source said, but I do have a document that might be of interest to you. So he sends me this document, and this is in 2003. He sends me the document that is very specific information about the Groton graduating class of 1988. It had the name of every kid in the class, had their SAT score, their SAT 2 scores, their class rank, where they applied to college, where they got in, and where they got rejected. And looking over this document, you could see that there was absolutely very little relationship between their academic quality and where they got in. You know, that was not the determining factor. And a lot of the names were, of course, household names, and you could see that they would get preference as sort of celebrities or donors. You know, the author David Halberstam's daughter was there. She hadn't done very well in math, but she got into Brown. You know, there's just many of them. But the one that struck me, there were two things that struck me. One was that there was a Korean-American kid named Henry Park, and he had done very well in the SATs. I think he got 1560 or something like that. And he was highly ranked in the class, and yet he didn't get into any of his top 6 choices, which were, you know, mainly Ivy League schools and places like that. And then there was another kid named Margaret Bass, who, you know, if he was 10th in the class of 80 or 90, she was 40-something. Her SAT scores were maybe 1,100 or 1,200, and she got in. She was the only one in that class to get into Stanford. And I noted that her father was the chairman of the board at Stanford, the oil tycoon billionaire Robert Bass, and he and his brothers are each worth billions of dollars. The billionaire Bass brothers. And the father was the chairman of the board at Stanford. He was also the chairman of the board at Groton, or on the board at Groton. But anyway, she had gotten into Stanford. So it seemed, at the time, colleges said, and to some extent they still say this today, that these preferences are just a tiebreaker between equal applicants, that admissions is based in merit, that there's a firewall between fundraising and admissions, and all this stuff. Well, this document proved that that was not the case. So, of course, I had the problem of proving that this was an authentic document. Just because my source had given it to me didn't mean it was a real Groton document. And I talked to my editors in New York. There were 80 or 90 names on the list. And they said, well, if you can get 20 or 25 of these kids to confirm that these were their scores and this is where they applied and the information is accurate, you can do the story. So eventually I tracked down 20 or 25 kids on the list. You know, they were all out of high school. It was 5 years later. They were out of college, most of them. I found them all. And they confirmed all the stuff on there and talked to me about it. And that made a great story. And then I did a story after that about, I took the members of the Supreme Court who were supposed to decide on affirmative action. And I pointed out that a lot of their kids had benefited from various preferences of getting into college, preferences for rich white people. You know, Sandra Day O'Connor, you know, she was a Stanford grad. Well, all her kids went to Stanford. That probably wasn't unrelated to the fact that they were legacies and their mother was already a famous federal judge by the time they applied to Stanford. Things like that. So that all happened, and then those stories ran, and then the Supreme Court then upheld affirmative action by a 5-4 vote. And, you know, various commentators wrote that my articles were responsible. I had embarrassed them into supporting affirmative action by pointing out the other preferences that their families had benefited from, and that they were probably afraid that if they abolished affirmative action, legacy preference would be abolished, because the two are very connected. You know, one's a preference for underrepresented minorities, and one's a preference basically for rich white alumni children. If you eliminate the preference for minorities, it's hard to politically keep legacy preference. So with that, I got a book contract and to turn this whole thing into a book, and I wrote a book called The Price of Admission, and which was a bestseller, and it's been selling like crazy in the last week because of this new scandal, which I'm glad to see. You know, I benefit from the fact that nothing has changed despite my critique of the system. In fact, everything I described has gotten worse in the last dozen years for various reasons. So my book is still very pertinent. If they ever reformed the system, nobody would want to read my book anymore, but it's, you know, it's as accurate today as it was then. So, and the other thing, I don't know if you guys read the story that Matt sent you, but the other thing that worked to my advantage was, this was sheer serendipity, was when I wrote my book, I decided that I had to do a chapter about Harvard. Because I'm a Harvard graduate, and my stories in the journal, my series, it didn't really have much about Harvard. And I said, I don't want anybody to think that I'm going soft on my alma mater. That's not what I do. I like to bite the hand that fed me, you know. So I said, I have to do a chapter on Harvard. Well, Harvard had something called the Committee on University Resources. Still has it today. This is where they put their biggest donors, or the people they think are going to be their biggest donors. And they wine and dine them. They bring them to Harvard, and they have their most famous faculty, talk to them about what they're working on, make them feel like they're on the inside. And, they cultivate them because that's the source of, gifts for their endowment. So my idea was I'll take these 400 people on the Committee on University Resources, and I'll analyze how many of their kids went to Harvard. And if I can, Harvard, even at the time, today they admit like 4% of their applicants. Back then, maybe it was 10%. I said, if I can show that, a huge proportion of their kids are admitted to Harvard, that'll show the preference to donors. Here, I'm going to do a study. So that will involve quite a bit of work because I had to take 400 people and find out where all their kids went to college. Now, in some cases, they were in Who's Who in America, which often lists, at least I got the names of the kids out of there, which was a help. In other ways, there's these alumni, there's like these reunion reports. Somebody is a 25th reunion, they write a report saying, for the Harvard book saying, I've had a wonderful 25 years and I'm now a billionaire and I have 3 kids and all of them went to Harvard and here are their names and stuff. So through the reunion reports, through Who's Who in America, through online research, I found maybe 3/4 of the kids I needed. And I had a source inside Harvard. If I couldn't find a kid, they would give me the name and tell me where they went to college. So I completed my study, and of course, I eliminated the people on the committee who weren't old enough didn't have kids, or their kids weren't old enough to apply to Harvard. And then I took all the other kids, and I found that 50 or 60% of their kids had gone to Harvard, which for a place that admitted less than 10% of its students was, I thought, quite a startling conclusion. Now, in the course of this, I had to research everybody on the committee. When I went over the committee, I still remember this, I found these names, Charles Kushner and Cyril Statmauer Kushner, something like that. Charles and Cyril Kushner. I didn't know who they were, but I did a little quick research on them, and it showed me a couple things. One thing it showed me was that neither of them were alumni, which was a little unusual because most of the people on this committee had gone to Harvard, and hence they were loyal to the university and were giving a lot of money. Also, it helped get their kids in. But these people had no prior connection to Harvard. Another thing I noticed was that both of them, the father, the 2 parents, the couple, were both on the committee. Often it was just one member of a family. So this indicated, boy, they must be pretty rich. And then the third thing I noticed was that Charles had recently gone to prison for hiring a prostitute to seduce his brother-in-law and then videotaping it so that he could send it to his sister with whom he was on the outs. So apparently this broke a number of laws, and he was in prison, yet he was still on Harvard's Committee on University Resources. He wasn't in a position though to go to the various events where they were wining and dining them. But anyway, so I'm thinking this is pretty interesting. Criminal father, no affiliation with Harvard. How do they show up in the Committee on University Resources? I checked into the kids. So there were 2 sons. There was Jared, and I think the younger one is Joshua, if I remember right. And so I started calling Jared's high school to talk to the guidance counselors and the principal and the classmates and so on. And rarely do you find such unanimity that somebody wasn't a very good student and didn't deserve to get into an Ivy League college. Everybody agreed on that point. He hadn't taken the top courses. He wasn't very motivated. He was bright enough, but there were many better students. And this is something that helped my research a great deal all along on this topic, which is that in general, Americans believe in equal opportunity and upward mobility and merit. So we believe it as a society. It's part of our controlling values. And also, we believe it individually about people. So, for example, guidance counselors at high schools, it offends their sense of fair play when they're trying to match kids with the high school that's the best fit for them, and the valedictorian doesn't get into Princeton or Yale or wherever, and a kid who's ranked 60th in the class does because the parents are rich and are pledging a big gift. So often those people on background would fill me in on the reality of what had happened in a given case, and that was extremely helpful. In this case, everybody was united in saying that he wasn't a top student, and they were surprised that he got into Harvard. And then because the father had recently been prosecuted, there was an extensive court file on Charles Kushner's case, and in there was a list of charitable donations and amounts, and that's where I found that the father had pledged $2.5 million to Harvard around the time Jared had applied there. And I also I got the guy who had been president of Harvard at the time on the phone, Neil Rudenstein. He was no longer president, but he had been when Jared applied, and he was in a chatty mood, and he told me that Kushner, the father, had come to see him and talked about making a gift and how generous he was prepared to be and so on. So that all went in my book. It was one of many examples in that Harvard chapter, but I did give it a fair bit of attention because of the sensational aspects of the case. And so, then lo and behold, I watched in wonder as Jared married Ivanka Trump, even then kind of a celebrity in New York. Then his father-in-law ran for president. Amazingly enough, he got elected president. And then Jared all of a sudden became like senior advisor or whatever he is in charge of Middle East diplomacy. And everybody and their brother started citing my book and what I had found about Jared's, how he got into college. Now, there are many great and famous people in history in America and everywhere else who didn't do well in high school and turned out to be great leaders. I don't think Franklin Roosevelt was a particularly outstanding student at Groton, for that matter. I remember reading his letters home. He was a B student or something. He was fine, but he wasn't great. But, still it was interesting, and it shed light on the kind of privilege that, the Kushners had and that the Trumps in general have had. And so that story resonated. And then, fast forward to this past week, and this new scandal seems to kind of echo everything I said in my book. For example, my book, I had a chapter about how, as I mentioned, there's a preference for athletes in college admissions in sports that most kids don't get a chance to play. Obviously, this guy, Rick Singer, who masterminded this scheme, knew that too, because one of the things he did was he got his kids into college by creating fake athletic profiles for them in rich people's sports like crew. Lori Loughlin, the Full House actress, her daughters got into USC because Singer, bribed an administrator there to pretend that, to go along with the fib that the daughters were on the women's crew team. In general, the sports that he chose to fake the kids' credentials for were not football or basketball or baseball, but these kind of niche patrician sports where the admissions committee would say, well, we don't know who's a rower and who isn't, but, it's a rich family, that makes sense. So, again, it became a kind of, it showed that not much had changed since I wrote my book, and like I said, that was helpful in sort of keeping the book in the public eye. I guess I'll just wrap up by saying that actually, in the 12 or 13 years since my book came out, things in this area have gotten considerably worse from the standpoint of the tilt of college admissions toward the wealthy. For one thing, it's even harder to get into most schools, including Northeastern, I would think, than it was then. They've become ever more selective. The reason is colleges hold down their student body size for the most part, so that as the population grows, they don't keep up. So there's the same number of slots for more applicants. Another reason is the sort of widening income inequality. So, since the financial crisis, we've had this growing division in the country between the haves and the have-nots, and the number of billionaires has gone way up, and the super rich, and they have a lot of money. They're desperate to get their kids in. They see that Harvard only admits 4% of the kids, and that makes them susceptible to the kind of schemes that there was a lot of publicity about these last couple weeks. Another factor is, overall, the proportion of alumni who donate to universities has been going down. So these I'm talking about small gifts, like $50, $100, $200 a year, and so that makes universities also more dependent on big givers. So for all these reasons, I mean, it's a situation where there's tremendous pressure on university admissions to let in kids from families that can afford to make a big gift, which is kind of the situation I highlighted in my book. Also, I don't know if people noticed, but there was a Northeastern connection in this scandal. There was a guy, what was it, Hernandez was his name?
I'm sure it was 400 grand that was something,
I think the part I remember, there might have been some of these. The part I remember reading in the complaint was that he wanted to get his own kid into some a named school, and so but Singer gave him a break on the payment. He didn't have to pay if he would get somebody else into Northeastern, and he had been a former board member and he had a lot of connections, so he used his connections and got that kid in, and that's legal, which raises one of the interesting questions. This whole debate with this scandal is, what's the line exactly? Like, yes, legally bribing somebody to get your kid into college is a crime, and making a donation of $400,000 to $4 million, whatever, to a university to get your kid in is not a crime. But is there really an ethical or moral difference between the two things, or are they just two sides of the same coin? Now, that's a more complicated issue than it might appear, because if you're bribing somebody individually, who knows how they use that money? Whereas if you make a big gift to a university, at least they say they'll use it for a good purpose, like financial aid or something like that. So you could argue maybe there's a ethical difference, but it's certainly not particularly clear. And that's one of the issues I've been asked about over and over about until this came to light. So just to circle back to where I started, so I think I've finally just come to terms with the fact that this issue is going to hound me for the rest of my life. Nobody's ever going to fix it, because rich people, whether they're Democrats or they're Republicans, all benefit from it. They all want these admissions preferences. I had a chapter in my book about the, quote, legacy establishment that supports these preferences. So the system's never going to change, and there's going to be constant scandals, and people are just going to keep asking me about it. And no matter what else I write, my obituaries, if I have one, will say, he's the guy who wrote about how rich people buy their kids' way into college. So that's just the way it is, and I'm giving into questions about this, or like I say, anything else that I'll be glad to talk about other stuff I've covered as well.
Patriots or Red Sox too.
Yeah, sports. I love sports, as Matt knows. So
You have had more than 20 years of experience covering and investigating education issues. What's your one personal takeaway of it?
Well, I've mostly written about higher education
Yeah.
in America, and I mean, the main takeaway that connects all my work is that higher education in America is a business, and that when academic and educational concerns conflict with financial concerns, the financial concerns usually win out. So like my other book, like I mentioned, is called Spy Schools, and it's about how there's this sort of hidden spy war on campus, because there are some foreign students who are looking to steal research or find contacts or learn about American policy, and at the same time the FBI and CIA are on campus trying to recruit foreign students and send them home as our agents. So it's about this hidden spy war. So, and universities, I've unearthed any number of cases, but universities, they look the other way there, mostly for financial reasons. So, for example, they don't want to identify a foreign student as a possible spy, because they're opening campuses overseas, and they have a lot of foreign students who come in that pay full tuition and so on. But they don't want to offend the FBI and CIA either, because they get a lot of research funding from the Pentagon and from our intelligence agencies. So greed overrides, probably good sense there. And obviously in the admissions sector, I support a firewall between fundraising and admissions, but it doesn't happen because universities, they tarnish their admissions process because they use it to raise money. So I would say, I started out by looking at it as a business, and when you look, you find, and what I found was that, higher education, it calls itself nonprofit, but it's as interested in profit as any other industry.
We'll take some questions.
Yes.
He talked about the haves and have-nots in society, but the same thing sort of happening in higher education. That the other big story over the last months have been the number of small colleges that are closing and the pressure on these small colleges to attract students and to attract the resources that they need to stay in business. It seems as though that's likely to escalate too, that schools that are elite are becoming ever more elite, and there are more of them that that fit into this category. And it seems to me that in Northeastern's case, which is sort of fairly typical of the middle class school becoming an elite school, that was by design. They have consciously found a way to raise their number of applicants, which decreases the admission rates, which makes them seem more selective. Which makes them seem more desirable, which has left the Hampshire colleges and the Newbury colleges and the other people starving for, what do you see as the evolution of that in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I mean, you raise a lot of good points, and I do see that trend, as you say, and let me take each side of the sector first. I mean, with the schools that are closing, I mean, I think that it's a tough economic model for them. They charge, if they're a private school, they charge the same, 40, 50, 60,000 that, the elite schools do. And it becomes, but they face a lot of competition where other people are underpricing them, right? I mean, you can go online and take classes. You could take classes at for-profit colleges. Not that I recommend that. I'm not a big fan of for-profit colleges, but, there's community colleges and state schools. It's, a lot of them, not Hampshire, but a lot of them date from an era where education was less national. And a lot of kids, went to the local college, and in an era when it's very national, they have trouble, sustaining a base of students. Now, I feel particularly bad about Hampshire because that's in my hometown, which is Amherst. And I had a lot of friends in Hampshire, and when I was in high school, I made money by selling pizza in the halls of the dorms in Hampshire. I'd be going, Hot Bell's Pizza here, and so I like the kids. So I have a lot of, affinity for the place. And also, I think it stands for something in American education because it was experimental, and it's still a little bit different from most schools, and I think that's admirable. I mean, I think there's too many sort of cookie cutter schools in the United States where the universities are indistinguishable between each other. And Hampshire stood for a certain kind of learning and self-discovery. Now, the problem with that from a financial point of view is that because of that, kids often took an awful long time to graduate from Hampshire because they encourage you to go at your own pace and pursue your own interests. And sometimes they took years and years to graduate. Sometimes they didn't graduate at all, which meant that they have a smaller alumni base. So, it's unfortunate that what's a really innovative educational model is not necessarily the best financial model. So I feel bad about that. And then at the other end, yeah, you're right. I mean, schools like Northeastern have been very shrewd about making the transition from kind of urban school limited to that urban area to, sort of a selective, high prestige type school. And I mean, I think it's been smart in a number of ways. I mean, it spread its brand by opening other campuses or places around the country. My sense is there's probably, it might have been once thought of as primarily a commuter school, but now I doubt it is. It's probably a lot of kids in dorms. And so it's made it, it's been smart about maximizing its brand. It benefits from being in Boston, where students want to gravitate to. So I think it's a smart move. I mean, other schools have kind of done the same thing. You think of George Washington, maybe on Washington. Again, an appealing city, or America. This is a school that might once have been more commuter. And to some extent, BU has moved up in the world too. Maybe not as much, but through these same kind of things. And I applaud the entrepreneurship. My one issue would be don't do it on the back of admissions. And I haven't looked enough at Northeastern to know if it does or it doesn't, but most schools do to some extent. But I think they've made a series of shrewd, strategic moves to position themselves. Yeah.
In a state like Texas, they passed legislation where I think the top 10% of each graduating class
Yeah.
Higher class protests. Do you think that would work across the country or at least different states? Do you think there's any future in that? Or like, is UMass Amherst just going to keep getting clogged up? If they're going to have to go to other schools, stuff like that.
That's a good question. Now, of course, and that's, a knowledgeable question. The reason they have the top 10% plan in Texas is because affirmative action was banned there under the Hopwood decision of federal court. So they were concerned about diversity. So Texas has numerous high schools that are, all Hispanic or all black or whatever. So by taking the top 10% of the class, it doesn't sound overtly like a racial preference, but what happens is you guarantee some diversity in the student body, right? Because you have a certain number of, the top 10% of an all-black high school is going to be black, and you'll have some of those kids will decide to go to the University of Texas. So it wouldn't work as well for that purpose in a state that was not as segregated in terms of racially. So that would be one issue there. I'll tell you one funny story about that too, which is at the Journal, I did a story about that plan when it first came out. And it turned out, I looked at the suburban high schools. See, that hurts the suburban high schools, right, the top 10%, because their kids would do well on the SATs, would ordinarily be getting a lot of kids into the University of Texas. So the suburban high schools were concerned. And I visited one, I think outside Dallas, where it was mystifying. They were getting 15% of their kids to qualify as the top 10% of the school. I'm like, how does this happen? Well, what they were doing was, let's say your top 10% of your senior class, the cutoff was a 3.8 grade point average or 3.7. Well, they would tell the freshman class that, and they would say, everybody who's now entering the school, if you get that same 3.7, we're going to count you in the top 10%. Well, there was grade inflation, and the teachers all knew they needed 3.7, so boom, 15% of the students qualified as the top 10%. And I remember I explained this story to my editor. It's a classic example of how everybody games the rules in higher education. My bureau chief, he was a very smart guy. He said, everything's bigger in Texas, even 10%. I said, thanks, that's my lead. And that became the lead. It was a great story. So then Texas passed a law that said that in the 10% rule, 10% means 10%, which I think is the only time any state has ever had to pass that kind of a law. But so whether it would work in other states, well, other states that have affirmative action, they don't really need the top 10% rule because they're using affirmative action to accomplish the same purpose. Now, Texas did ultimately, I think affirmative action then became legal there again, and they used them both. But if affirmative action is banned by the Supreme Court, which this Harvard case is going to move up the ranks and they may end up banning affirmative action, I would expect a lot more states to adopt top 10% rules. And California has a version of it. It might be top 6%, top 8%. Same thing for the University of California. One of the issues is, do the kids just get into the system, or do they get into the actual flagship school or whatever? And I think it may be different in Texas from California, but I would expect to see a lot more of it in some of the states where they have high schools that are predominantly, one minority or another, and affirmative action is banned. I mean, it's not something a private university could adopt as easily, right? Because you don't have enough students, you'd just be swamped. And I think that has been somewhat of an issue of Texas. I mean, University of Texas is a big school, but the top 10% of high schools in Texas is an awful lot of kids. And if you I think they end up taking more and more kids under the top 10%, and then they also want to take out-of-state kids who have, really good records or whatever. And I don't think there's room for them all, and I think that's kind of an issue. I mean, God, there must be hundreds of thousands of kids in Texas who are in the top 10% of their high schools at any given year. So they haven't really figured out that part of it, but that is the kind of ostensibly race-neutral plan which will become extremely widespread if affirmative action gets banned, which is probably going to happen sooner or later, but who knows when. Yes?
I work in a program on campus here where I work exclusively with students from Boston, most of whom are from lower income homes. I'm wondering what you'd recommend to a student coming out of high school from a lower income background as far as the path to take through college.
Well, I think that, you know, you probably, I mean, obviously it depends a great deal on the student's record and class rank and stuff like that, but I mean, I would generally, obviously, if you're low income, you've got to pay attention to the financial side of it. You know, it'd probably be smart not to take on a huge amount of debt. So, you know, maybe going to, you know, UMass, you know, a public school, or, you know, getting a good scholarship from a private college. You know, you want to avoid a situation where, as often happens with, say, you know, for-profit schools, you know, you end up taking on, you know, an awful lot of loans. You know, I mean, that's just can hamstring you for a long time. So that'd be one recommendation. The other is, you know, there are colleges that now, right alongside the preferences for the wealthy, they have a preference for, say, somebody who's the first generation in their family to attend college. And if the college is, you know, boasting about a preference like that, you know, and the students you're counseling would be the first generation in their family to go to college, I'd certainly stress that in the application, you know, because you know, it's almost like the colleges, they don't want to get rid of the preferences for the wealthy. So instead of getting rid of those, they're trying to counterbalance them with other preferences, make the system ever more complicated. I mean, it's like the tax code or something, right? So I think that, you know, the first generation preference is something to be well aware of. And the other thing is, you know, it's good that they have you, because a lot of inner city high schools don't necessarily have kind of individualized counseling for kids, and kids may not be aware of the opportunities, and they, you know, they should, you know, if they're good students, they should, you know, raise their expectations. You know, if you're a really good student, try Northeastern or try BC or BU and see if you can get a scholarship. You know, don't settle for a community college or an online school or a for-profit school. That'd be some of the advice I'd give. Yes.
What made you to write about children of alumni or donor or both, um, about them getting privilege on colleges admission? Though some, I mean, meanwhile, this phenomenon has been seen by some as a tradition.
So you're saying, why did I take this particular angle?
What made you to write about it?
Well, I think, you know, there's always a deeply rooted cause. And the question was, why did I write about preferences for the rich in college admissions? How did I get onto that? Well, you look back and you say, well, there's always kind of a subconscious, deeply rooted reason, and then there's a more immediate reason. The more immediate reason here was I was covering education for the Wall Street Journal. My bureau chief was nagging me, asking me for something new about the Michigan case. And I looked at the documents and I saw these preferences and I said, okay, this is a fresh angle. Now then you can say, well, why did I particularly focus on this as a fresh angle? Particularly when you could say at the Wall Street Journal it had a very rich readership who I was certain to, you know, piss off with these stories, and of course I did. But, you know, I mean, it looked to me like a really interesting and important thing to say. And also, you know, I come from a, you know, a sort of meritocracy type background. I mean, I went to a public high school. My father went to City College of New York, you know, as a immigrant. He went to the public university there. You know, my parents taught at a public university. You know, I didn't have any preferences when I applied to Harvard. So I'm like everybody else. You know, I kind of believe that merit should determine college admissions, and these kind of things upset me. You know, I think other than the fact that the issue has not been reformed, I think another reason for my book Staying Power is that if you read it, it's truly written in anger. You know, I was very outraged by what I was writing about. And you can't fake that outrage when you write a book. I mean, my spy book, I think, is a much better read and much more interesting, but I wasn't as outraged, you know, because there were reasons for, you know, there's kind of reasons on both sides and so on. But when I wrote The Price of Admission, I was mad. And, you know, that can fuel good journalism if you have a genuine, you know, sense of outrage, and I had that, and I think that traces to my personal family background, and also to being an American, because, you know, our whole belief is in the American dream and equal opportunity, and, you know, I come out of that. Yeah.
Did you read the Boston Globe's valedictorian piece that came out recently?
I saw it, but I didn't read it. It was about how valedictorians have had struggles since then. Was that in college or in careers after college?
Altogether, kind of just looking at a bunch of APS valedictorians, basically explaining how they were set up for success. Some success stories are really rounded out ways, like dropping out of Boston College and then joining the military, stuff like that.
I see.
As,
I didn't have a chance to read it, but I also I didn't find the premise that surprising, because just my reporting has indicated that it's a roundabout route, and that if you're a valedictorian in a high school, a lot depends on the kind of preparation that high school gives you. And some high schools prepare you better than others, or offer more advanced placement courses or whatever. So even valedictorians can struggle academically if they come from a high school where they weren't, exposed to kind of college level preparatory material. So I wasn't too surprised by that. I'll tell you another story about a piece I wrote at the Journal that tangentially relates to this, because it was about a valedictorian. Are we running out of time, or do I have time to tell us?
Now we get 15 minutes.
Okay, so this involved, I was assigned at the Journal. It was a non-education, well, it was kind of education. There's a company called Cisco Systems that does networking, right? So Cisco Systems had started this program in the inner city to hire kids to be, starting level systems people, whatever they do, networking people. So I was supposed to write about this program in the inner city and was it going to work or not, and so on, and what an important experiment it was. So I went up to a high school in the Boston area. Now, I think it was in East Boston, but I might be wrong. It's been a long time since I did this. And I interviewed the Cisco Systems instructor and so on. And he said, well, go talk to the kids in the class and ask them why they're doing this program, why they want to work for Cisco Systems. So I pulled, sidled up to one young woman, and I said, why are you doing this? And she said, it seems like a good opportunity. And I said, well, how are you doing in school? And she said, oh, I'm the valedictorian. So I said, well, if you're the valedictorian, why aren't you going to college? Why are you going to work for Cisco Systems? And she said, oh, I'm undocumented. So, by the government rules, I can't get financial aid if I'm undocumented, so I can't go to college, so that's why I'm going to work for Cisco. And I said, that seems really sad and unfair. And she said, well, actually, 3 of the last 5 or 4 of the last 6 valedictorians here had the same problem, so they didn't go to college either. So I was like, whoa. And at that point, I forgot all about the story about the Cisco Systems program. I said, this is a story, all these valedictorians who can't go to college. And now that young woman, she didn't want to be written about because she didn't want it known that she was undocumented. The Journal, you have to use last names. They wouldn't have gone with some anonymous story. And so I didn't write about her, but after weeks of searching, I found an even more compelling story. This was about a young woman on the Cape. Her name was Monique Silva. And she had come from Brazil with her parents, and she was deaf. And her parents didn't know sign language. They didn't know how to communicate with her. She grew up not communicating with anybody. They basically dumped her on the steps of an elementary school in Hyannis or wherever it was, on the Cape. And a teacher there took pity on her, learned sign language, and taught her. And Monique turned out to be very bright. And the teacher's name was Susan Annarino. And she taught Monique, and she was good enough that the town all pitched together and paid for her to go to a private high school for the deaf in Connecticut, where she did very well. She applied to Gallaudet, which was the leading university for the deaf, which is that, and she got in. And at that point, they notified her that she wasn't eligible for financial aid because she was undocumented. Now, she didn't know she was undocumented. Her parents hadn't told her. They didn't communicate with her, basically. They didn't know sign language. She had no clue. And so the superintendent of the school system had told me about her, and he said it's heartbreaking. She couldn't go to Gallaudet. That was a couple months ago. Now she's working in a laundry here. So I went down to interview her. Susan Annarino served as the interpreter, and the first time, then she was too busy, and then I would have to write down my questions on a sheet of paper, and then Monique would write down the answers on her break from the laundry. And it took a long time to get all this information, but she signed a waiver so I could get her high school record. It was very poignant. And I wrote a story about how, this lack of, inability to get financial aid for the undocumented had ruined her life. And I handed in to my editor, the same guy I've mentioned a couple times, the guy who mentioned the 15%, everything's bigger in Texas. I looked up a couple hours later, and his head was down at his computer, and he was crying. So I said, oh, this must be a pretty powerful story. So they sent it down to New York, and they didn't change it much, and it ran. And the next day, my phone rang off the hook, and people pledged, I don't know, $80,000 or $100,000, and she went to Gallaudet, and she graduated, and I think still lives in the U.S. today. I don't know if she's undocumented or not. She might have got married, which might have made her documented. I don't know the immigration rules, but so I'm kind of aware from that valedictorians take a lot of different paths in Boston. But that's one of my rare stories that was kind of a sympathetic protagonist, and it's very nice. I ran into she used to send me like roses every year, for a few years, or Susan Anarino maybe did, or because I got her into college. So I haven't only destroyed people, in case anybody wants to know. That's what I mostly do, but sometimes I help people.
We'll take one more question.
It has to be one more.
Sure. Oh, that's a good question. How do I get them to talk to me? Well, back when I was doing this for my series at the Journal, I would reach out to the children before the parents, because one of my general rules of reporting in journal, and of course the children, I say children, but they were, in college. They were, like your ages. They weren't. I wasn't trying to get 6-year-olds to talk or something. They were in college, and one of my general observations in a career in journalism is that young people and old people are more likely to talk than people in the middle. Young people have a kind of faith in the system. Old people, well, they've fought their battles and their, careers are over and they don't have anything to lose, and so they talk to. So I decided to approach the kids, and the way I would approach them is to make clear that it wasn't just, I didn't just have a prurient interest in how they had done in college, that there was an important issue here. So, I'd call them up. I'm thinking of one young woman in particular, and I'd say, look, you may be aware that the United States Supreme Court is poised to eliminate affirmative action for minorities in college admissions, but, my sense is, or I've heard, that, maybe you benefited from affirmative action of a different kind. My sense is your parents are major donors, and now you're here, and, can you tell me your experience? Or, and often when you present something to somebody as not just, oh, gee, what were your test scores? But, you are a face of a national issue that's important and affects a lot of people, not just you. It's, that can sometimes help in getting somebody to talk. And that was quite effective, particularly with female students. I got better luck in getting them to talk than men. But that's how I would get them to talk. And then once you talk to the kid, then you call the parent. The parent says, are you crazy? I'm not going to talk to you about how my kid got into college. And then you say, well, that's interesting, because your kid already, I talked to her for an hour, and she told me that you pledged X amount of money, or you did this, or you did that, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on it. And sometimes then the parents would talk. So it worked pretty well. And I mean, I would identify these families because at the time, universities would often boast about gifts. They'd have a parent advisory committee. You could be pretty sure the parents on that committee had given a lot of money. And then, Harvard, the Committee on University Resources. If you looked in the right place, they were putting all these big donor parents, alumni or not, on various committees. And so you'd have the names, and then, if the name was Smith, you were stuck. But if the name was a really unusual name, and you put that name in the student directory, you could be pretty sure that that was the kid of the parent on the advisory committee. And so that's how I'd identify the parents, I'd identify the kids, talk to the high school guidance counselors, who, like I say, were often willing on background to let you know if this kid had really merited the admission or if it was a stretch because of a donation. And, you know, you assemble the information from all those sources, and then you have enough to publish it. That was pretty much the method. Nobody had ever done anything quite like this before. You know, it was an open secret that, you know, money helped in college admissions, but nobody had ever really taken the time to show how big the advantage was and put, you know, identified people who had benefited from it and really dig into it the way I did. That's what made it so novel. And so I think people were maybe, you know, their guard wasn't necessarily up because these were the kinds of things that nobody was really asked about. You know, it was like the last dirty little secret of, you know, the American aristocracy. And I exposed it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Dan. That was great.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Good questions.